Sarah. I think we've got Mr. Bowie instead of Dr. Pettigrew visible on the screen at the moment. If Dr. Pettigrew could say something, I think the screen will revert to her.
Just say nothing for the moment, Mr. Bowie.
Okay, I'm here.
Good.
Thank you. Dr. Pettigrew, just a handful of further questions for you. You told us about the process for notifying GPs when patients were infected with HIV. Was there any similar process for notifying GPs in respect of patients who were infected with hepatitis B?
Oh yes, we would have informed patients, GPs, yes.
And then in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis, can you recall whether you were involved in diagnosing patients with non-A, non-B hepatitis in the 80s?
No, I wasn't.
So would that have been done by Dr. Han?
Well, I don't think we made any, I mean, you can check with Dr. Han, but I don't think we made any specific diagnosis. Well, we didn't have any symptomatic patients and I don't think we had any instance of liver function tests which suggested it. So without the test for the virus, I don't think we were identified or diagnosed any patients with non-A, non-B at the time.
Then going back to the question of the commercial concentrates, the NHS concentrates and the issue about their solubility, do you know whether that concern was ever drawn to the attention of PFC by Dr. Willoughby or anyone else at York Hill?
I think it was quite well known, and as I said, reading final chapter 21 in the Penrose Report, reading the final Penrose Report, chapter 21, there was reference to that. Do you want me to give you the reference?
No, don't worry about that. I'm just wondering whether you've got any independent recollection, leaving aside what's in the Penrose Report.
I don't, and I wouldn't have had any communication with SNBT.
You mentioned the availability of ARMA funding for attendance at scientific meetings. Who would that potentially fund to attend scientific meetings? Would it be just consultants or doctors, nurses? Who would it cover?
I was funded as well to go to some meetings by ARMA.
Were those meetings in Scotland or England or?
ARMA funded me to go to the World Federation of Haemophilia meeting. Both Dr. Han and I went to in 1984 to the World Federation of Haemophilia meeting, which was in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro.
And so the expenses associated with that were funded by ARMA, were they?
Because obviously the NHS, certainly wouldn't have funded all of it, so ARMA helped with funding.
And during the time when Dr. Willoughby was consultant, do you recall any ARMA funding for any similar meetings or conferences?
Yes, I was very surprised when I was asked if I wanted to go to the World Federation of Haemophilia meeting in Stockholm. And in fact, it was in 1983, but I say I was surprised because it was my impression looking back that it was earlier than that, because I don't remember anything about it.
And do you know whether Dr. Willoughby himself received funding from ARMA to attend anything similar?
I don't think he went to any of the World Federation of Haemophilia meetings, no. I don't know about any other meetings that might be funded.
Could we just look again at the table about product use? Look, it's INQY 40242. And if we look at table 2 at the bottom of the page, which looks at PFC versus commercial concentrate, we can see, as you referred to earlier, that in 1981, 1982, more PFC product was being used proportionately than had been the case in the previous 2 years.
Yes.
Whilst Dr. Willoughby was still consultant. Do you know whether that was because of whether his increased use of the Edinburgh PFC concentrate was because of safety concerns?
I couldn't answer that question. I thought it was probably because there were more supplies of PFC, but I couldn't answer that with certainty.
Do you have any recollection, so that can come down to you, do you have any recollection of the boys at York Hill being involved in a video project in about 1986 in which they were asked questions about HIV infection?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Do you have any recollection of boys at York Hill being involved in a video project in around 1986 in which they were asked questions and filmed answering about their infection with HIV?
I don't know if you're referring to the study that was done by Professor Parry Jones's department.
I'm simply asking a question that's been asked of me by a recognised legal representative. So, do you have any recollection yourself of any such project?
No. I know there was a project. We had approached the Department of Child and Family Psychiatry to see if we could get help with from a psychologist to see these boys. And they, Professor Parry Jones, thought it would be better to set up a project to assess whether there was a need for psychological intervention. And possibly as part of that, the boys were videoed, but I wasn't involved in the actual, so I couldn't say if that was the case or not.
I understand it to be the case that you visited schools to talk about the stigma of HIV, is that right?
No, we visited schools to advise them about, Sister Murphy and I, or Sister Murphy on her own, not to talk about the stigma of HIV, but to talk about haemophilia in general, and also to advise schools about the precautions to be taken in the case of any blood spillage or cuts, or to prevent transmission of hepatitis. We didn't mention prevention of AIDS because obviously we wouldn't have told the school that the child had been infected with the HIV virus, but it was common for us to do school visits for those purposes that I mentioned, with the parents' permission.
And in the course of those school visits, was the issue of the stigma associated with HIV ever raised?
Not that I recall.
Finally, Dr. Pettigrew, was there in the first half of the 1980s at York Hill any process or system or forum for, as it were, whistleblowing or raising concerns as a junior clinician about the policies that were in place, or any concerns about risks?
No, there weren't. But I have to say, I know we can look back in retrospect and see that there were possibly things could have been done differently, but I did have a great respect for Dr. Willoughby, and he was held in high regard.
So those are the questions I have for Dr. Pettigrew. I don't know whether Mr. Bowie has any, or whether you have any for herself.
Well, shall we ask Mr. Bowie first? Mr. Bowie.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. There are no questions that I would like to ask.
Thank you. I do have some, so if what I have to ask raises any further questions from you, Mr. Bowie, I'd be quite happy to entertain your asking them then. But thank you for the moment. Can we have Dr. Pettigrew back, please?
Dr. Pettigrew needs to say something again.
Yes, I'm here, sorry. Am I back?
Yes.
You ended that evidence just talking about Dr. Willoughby. And towards the end of this morning's session, or this afternoon's session, I think, you said that he did what he did in good faith, without being fully aware or without realising the severity of the potential risks.
I think with respect to that, he was not aware of the risks of HIV at the time. And again, from what Dr. Han reported in his evidence to Penrose of a discussion he had with Dr. Willoughby, Dr. Willoughby had told Dr. Han that he didn't think that non-A, non-B hepatitis was a serious condition.
Now, or was it, would you say, part of his job to be as fully aware as reasonably could be expected of the risks and the potential severity of those risks?
Yes, I'm sure it was, but I think, Sir Brian, there was quite a lot of debate among the haemophilia clinicians.
But it was his job, essentially, is what you've said. Unless he was aware, how would you expect junior members of staff, and for that matter, nurses and others working under him, to be aware?
If he wasn't aware, no, you wouldn't expect members of staff working under him to be aware, no.
So does that mean that a junior doctor, for instance, would have no expectation that they would themselves keep themselves up to date?
I think, this is something I asked myself, what steps, particularly in the early 80s, did I take to keep up to date? But as I say, I think the sort of job I was in didn't lend itself to having time to read papers, and you were very much dependent on information that was passed down from seniors.
Well, that brings me really to something else that you said earlier in your witness statement. Shumik, could we have back witness statement 3527002 and go to page 16? It's paragraph 37. Now, if we look at the middle paragraph there, you're talking about the policy about informing patients. There wasn't one. And then you say initial discussions with parents, and this is talking about HIV, I appreciate, but presumably the same would apply to non-A, non-B, were of the state of knowledge at the time. Can you help me with this? One of the questions that I'm going to have to answer at the end of this inquiry is what I make of the state of knowledge. It might be the state of knowledge of an individual clinician, but the way you're using those words there, you're talking about the state of knowledge generally, aren't you?
I think both.
Well,
but
how do I work out what was the state of knowledge generally, do you think?
well, that would. I think the state of knowledge held by a consultant or director of a haemophilia unit who was attending HCDO meetings and being party to reports, the likes of would have more knowledge and would be up to date with the state of knowledge at the time. For instance, would be up to date with the knowledge that patients with haemophilia had developed AIDS in the 1983. The state of knowledge, as you say, of the junior person would be dependent on that knowledge being passed on, or that junior person finding out that knowledge for themselves. Sorry, Sir Brian, can I go back to your original question?
Yes, it's about what you meant really by the state of knowledge. Whose knowledge? It's obviously knowledge more generally. You could only tell a patient what you knew, what your state of knowledge was, but you're talking here more generally.
Yes, and I think that refers to the fact that it was an evolving situation with regards to AIDS. I think, again, a parallel to the current COVID situation, the knowledge about COVID has increased over the last 9 to 10, 12, nearly 12 months as we've learned more about it. And it was the same, I think, at that time. It was an evolving situation. It was an unprecedented situation, and knowledge about the condition was accumulating all the time.
The expression "the state of knowledge," if you're right that it must, in this context, mean the knowledge by directors who derive their knowledge from the UK HCDO, that what one is looking at is the knowledge which the body of those who are said to be experts in haemophilia care ought to have. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, yes.
So that would depend, would it, then on them disseminating that knowledge to everyone else in if you like, the tree of care?
Yes.
Because you could only tell the patient either what you had discovered independently, which I imagine if you did, you'd want to check with someone else anyway, or what you had been told through this, as it were, chain of communication.
I think that would be correct, yes.
So it would follow that there would, in general, there ought to be some system for continuing education information to staff who are dealing with matters at a specialist level. Would that be fair?
Yes, and I think there was more discussion at that sort of level after 1983 in the department. Yes,
but before 1983, you told me there really weren't any meetings at which these sorts of matters were discussed. There were matters to discuss individual patients. That was about it. That's how I've understood your evidence.
Not so much in regard to haemophilia, no.
Yes. And one of the matters which I've heard about from other clinicians is that there was a general lack of knowledge coming through from the UK HCDO about the discussions of those who were reference centre directors at the heart of UK HCDO. The minutes weren't apparently circulated. That's what I've heard so far. And if you're right, in order for advice to be given as to the state of knowledge, that would have to be passed on, would it not?
Yes, it would. Yes.
You told us about how patients were making the running in asking about the risks of AIDS when they read in the papers, which I suppose reflected one part of the state of knowledge, but only a part and not a specialist part necessarily, what they'd read and what they understood and what they'd heard from the Haemophilia Society, which itself must depend upon the specialist advice of others, must it not?
Yes.
But they were coming to ask you about AIDS. None of them asked you about non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Not that I can recall, no.
If you didn't know about non-A, non-B hepatitis, then they might be excused for not knowing and not asking, I suppose.
Well, I certainly didn't know about it before 1984.
Yes. It would follow that if the evidence which I hear elsewhere is to the effect that the state of knowledge as you've defined it, and if I accept that definition, of course, was that there was non-A, non-B hepatitis as a serious risk, that was something which clearly should have been passed on to you. And if it had been, would you have raised it, you think, with the patients? You hadn't raised the risk of AIDS directly. You waited for them, in effect, to ask you about it.
So, Brian, are you talking about before 1984 or after 1984?
At any time before you knew.
Any time before I knew, I obviously wouldn't have passed that risk on to the patients because I wasn't fully aware of the risk myself.
Yes, well, that follows. It's a hypothetical question, really. Perhaps it's unfair to ask you, but I'll leave it there, and we can deal with it in submissions generally. It's not a reflection in respect of you. It's just a reflection generally on the evidence that I've heard.
And yeah, that I did, after 1984, as I've said in my already, that when I was taking blood for liver function tests, I did say to the parents that, that in some cases these changes could progress to more severe liver disease.
Yes.
And
just going back to the question of information and knowledge, in the course of your evidence this morning, you mentioned it just in passing, I think, the name Montagne, who, as we know, was the scientist who in May 1983 isolated the LAV virus, as he called it, which he thought was associated with the development of AIDS in some patients. When did you first become aware of that name, do you think?
I couldn't honestly say. I think I was more familiar with the name Gallo and the finding of HTLV3. So I don't think I was aware of the name Montagne in 1983. I might have become aware of that in 1984 after Gallo also discovered the HTLV3 virus.
So you think it wasn't until after the announcement of Gallo's discovery?
I can't be absolutely certain, Sir Brian, because it was quite a while ago, but it's my kind of feeling that that was probably the situation.
Yes, thank you. The next thing which I want to ask is completely different. Oh, before I pass away from knowledge, did anyone ever mention to you that, and this assumes that the information I have is correct, which is that Armour Pharmaceutical put in their data sheets or in their leaflets accompanying the document that if in October 1983 that it was to be assumed that their products carried the risk of AIDS?
No, I wasn't aware of.
No one told you that, because Armour products were the products that were used in Glasgow, the Children's Hospital, and had been by Dr. Willoughby before.
Sorry, Sir Brian, did you say October 1983?
Yes.
Uh-huh. And I think by that time we were probably using predominantly NHS and very little commercial concentrate, so that information may not have been available to us at the time.
But the little that you were using was Armour still, was it?
The little, yes. But I think probably the Armour used in 1983 would have been more at the beginning rather than at the end. But yes, certainly there was, if we were using some, it would be Armour commercial concentrate.
Just two further questions. The first is about children and cryoprecipitate. You've told us really about cryoprecipitate and the fact that it was preferred for children because it was safer. In earlier evidence, what has been described to me in respect of cryoprecipitate was that because of the quantity that was needed for most treatments, something like a horse syringe might have been used to get access. One of the problems with children is their veins may be very small indeed. So it's not easy to get venous access, is it?
No, it's not. And in fact, Dr. Willoughby mentions that in his book, in the text, in the chapter on haemophilia. But I think fortunately, we didn't have to give treatment to babies very often because it wasn't until they became mobile that they started having the knocks and the bumps and, exploring their environment. But I think in paediatric practice, people became quite expert at finding veins, and it was, you would have to sometimes put up drips for other reasons in babies. And as I say, fortunately, we didn't have to treat young babies very often. In fact, I don't recall treating a young baby.
So, whatever the difficulties might have been, additional difficulties in the case of a young child, or for that matter, anyone previously untreated with cryoprecipitate, the difficulties of gaining venous access, then the volume that one had to give to produce a suitable effect, that was outweighed, it was thought, by the risks of using cryoprecipitate, of using concentrate, and outweighed, if you like, by the fact that cryoprecipitate was safer, presumably.
Yes, and if the younger children were being treated with cryoprecipitate, obviously it was hospital-based, and a drip would be set up. So, and again, setting up drips in paediatric practice was not was quite common.
Yes. Yes, thank you. And the final question is, there were 2 patients who asked you to switch them effectively from home to hospital therapy, from concentrate to cryoprecipitate.
As far as I recall, it's true, yes.
Can you tell me, please, without identifying any details of the patients concerned, did either end up suffering from HIV infection?
Definitely one, yes.
But the other not, I see.
As far as I recall, yes.
Well, that's all that I have to ask. Thank you.
So there is just one further question I've been asked to ask arising out of Dr. Pettigrew's answers. Dr. Pettigrew, you referred to Gallo. Were you aware of Gallo's work prior to 1984, in particular his work in relation to HTLV 1 and 2?
No.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Pettigrew, is there anything further that you would like to add?
Yes, if I could just... I could just say, I heard Dr. Saeed Al-Ismail say in his final statement to the inquiry, and he said, "I firmly believe that the most distressing experience for a doctor is to witness harm in his patients from treatment received. This feeling of devastation, even if harm was unintended and unforeseen, is shared by my colleagues who look after patients with haemophilia." I agree wholeheartedly with what Dr. Ismail said. However, I know that any distress felt by those involved in treating patients with haemophilia pales into insignificance compared with the dreadful and enduring suffering of those families affected by this tragedy. To my mind, there's no greater tragedy for a parent than the loss of a child. And to watch that child suffer and die from a dreadful illness, and often because of the associated stigma, without the support of the extended family and friends. The effects in the families were far-reaching. There were long-lasting emotional and physical problems, not only in the children affected, but in their siblings and their parents. This was a terrible tragedy, and I am truly sorry for the suffering that they endured and they continue to endure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pettigrew. Sir Brian.
Can I really pick up on those last few remarks which we've just made? You've given us an account which is unusual because you were a junior doctor who wasn't in a training post, working effectively in a career grade, if you like, throughout most of the period with which this inquiry is centrally focused, for this period at any rate, in respect of HIV infection and non-A, non-B infection. And so you've given us an insight into that and what it was like. But you've done it, if I may say so, with considerable humanity And I'd like to thank you for that. To me, it was particularly evident when this morning, just before we broke for lunch, you were obviously struggling a little to describe what it was like to tell parents that their child had HIV infection. And when I asked you about about the distress that it caused, you didn't, as some others might have, indeed some have done, spoke first about their own feelings of distress before mentioning their patient. Your response was immediately to think of the distress caused to the patients, and only after that to think about yourself. And that, to me, said quite a lot, and quite a lot to your credit, if I may. But you've been refreshingly straightforward, and thank you for coming, or for being there, rather, for allowing us to invade your home for this purpose. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Sir Brian, for giving me the opportunity to give my testimony.
We had to have it.
Yes, but thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Richards.
So, Brian, we start tomorrow at 10 with the evidence of Professor Han.
10 o'clock tomorrow.